What happens when the castle and moat approach to cybersecurity collapses and the moat becomes the internet itself? Well, in today's cloud-first world, that's exactly the kind of reality that's facing modern enterprises, because the traditional perimeter hasn't vanished. It's merely splintered into thousands of API endpoints, Kubernetes clusters, and ephemeral workloads. And attackers no longer need to break in. They simply log in, blend in, and move quietly across east-west traffic until they eventually reach your crown jewels. Well, in today's episode, I'm joined by Doug Merritt. He's the CEO of Aviatrix, and we're going to discuss why legacy security no longer fits the distributed cloud-native world that we live in. And Doug has led global tech companies through every major inflection point over the last 2 decades, and today he's reimagining network security for the cloud era. And together, we're going to unpack the vulnerabilities hidden in modern architectures, try and understand how generative AI is transforming both sides of the cyber arms race, and understand why the industry has got to start thinking about visibility, identity, and control across every workload. So, if the cloud is now the enterprise network, how can security teams protect something they can't even see? Let's find out by officially introducing you to my guest. So, a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell everyone listening a little about who you are and what you do?
Well, thank you for the warm welcome. My name is Doug Merritt. I am the CEO of a company called Aviatrix that we'll spend a lot more time discussing. I have had a lifelong career post all the odd jobs that I had from 13 to 22, just trying to earn money on the side in the tech industry. My role prior to Aviatrix, I was a CEO at Splunk, which was to find a brand new category of data aggregation, and then went up serving cybersecurity and IT ops and DevOps in very unique ways. And that was a little bit over 7 years at Splunk. And before that, I'd been playing at the apps level, the database level, the infrastructure technology level across companies like PeopleSoft, SAP, a short stint at Cisco, a couple of startups, one of which I founded. So just a huge, passionate person about tech and the positive power it can have in the world. And some of the things we got to worry about with tech as well. There's always a balancing act. Nothing comes with only positives. But love the industry and love what we're trying to help the world with at Aviatrix.
It's a pleasure to have you join me today. And one of the things that attracted me to you, you set off my tech spidey sensors, was when I read that you said that cybersecurity, or the cybersecurity landscape, is more treacherous than ever, especially with AI accelerating both defense and attacks. Now, of course, the world of cybersecurity has always been a game of cat and mouse, so to speak. But how do you see this double-edged sword of AI reshaping security priorities for enterprises around the world? What do you see here?
So if we take a step back and just go 5,000 feet really quickly on that, why is it much more treacherous today? The world before cloud and SaaS was a little bit simpler. Every organization owned their own infrastructure on the on-prem world, and the bigger organizations had these really big, beautiful, hardened data centers. And if I really go back to why did the cyber industry begin to flourish? It was a pretty distinct demarcation point. When the internet began to become a commercial thing, and we first hooked the internet cable to one of those data centers, that really was the beginning of cyber the way we know it now. Yeah. Before then, cyber was all about physical security. You had your data center, you had thickened walls, raised floors, all the fun stuff with data centers. And it was mostly about biometric scanning and security of who's going in and out of that data center. But things were pretty nicely contained in that data center. You had to worry about if people were inserting floppy disks and the PC would have begun to, without the internet, would have begun to have some cyber elements to it. We had virus scanners and other things that McAfee and Symantec were trying to drive. But the internet really created the need for a very different posture on security. But before cloud, it was pretty contained. You controlled all the inputs and the outputs. You knew exactly where the internet, where it came in and where it went out, and you could protect your workloads and your environment from the internet. Is an incredible invention. It's propelled the world forward, but it was not built with security in mind. It was built with connectivity in mind. You go back to the advent of the internet, it was connecting trusted government agencies with each other, and then trusted universities with each other, and then universities are trusted with government agencies. But back then, everyone that used it actually physically knew each other. And then we began to use it for commercial use. And it's a great tool, just not hyper secure. As we move to cloud and then SaaS, the degree of complexity has gone up by orders of magnitude, and the degree of awareness and control has gone away from most IT teams and cyber teams. And what's changed now? The internet has become often the enterprise network. This untrusted thing is where the bulk of your sensitive data is flowing. And I'll give a really simple example for the listeners. The S3 storage framework, initially evangelized by AWS and Amazon, but it's just become a generic object store framework today that don't even know how many zettabytes of data across the globe are stored in. That is a internet addressable service. It is your S3 buckets are directly addressed through an internet connection. So the internet is woven through really important corporate landscapes for every organization. And the degree of insight and control that you have on all the SaaS connections is you're now a step removed. So it creates a really different landscape. We go into some of the different elements with cloud. But you now have generative AI and agentic AI, and we can triple click on that as well. But ultimately, there is a whole new emphasis that people have to have on how do I get security for AI? And it has many of the characteristics of cloud that we can go through. But on the other end, attackers now have these extremely sophisticated tools, and they are not asleep at the switch on what's happening with AI. So while AI poses new risks for every organization as we begin to all deploy it, it also arms the attackers with a whole different level of sophistication. And one of the things we love about agentic AI is it works 24/7. The attackers now working 24/7. So the degree of sophistication and insight that even non-organized attackers have has gone way up. And we've seen a strong advent that you've been talking about for a while over the past few decades, where it's not just a couple of rogue high school kids or disgruntled employees that are doing hacks. It is very well organized groups of either nation states or criminal consortia that are very different than the attackers that we were facing 10 to 15 years ago.
And one of the biggest challenges that you highlighted is that trusted internal traffic now rides over public infrastructure. And we've kind of seen the results of what can happen there on our news feeds. But just to further highlight the scale of the problem here, can you just expand on why this creates such a dangerous blind spot for organizations?
Yes. So if we go to zero trust as one of those overused topics these days,
Yeah.
It initially, from my experience and recollection, it really sprung up when these wonderful things started to enter the workplace. PCs to an extent, but PCs would generally govern over virtual private networks, and you could kind of control that. You could deliver a trusted network. As soon as we started bringing devices that were fully untrusted into the environment, we switched stances from a trusted set of interactions with a few untrusted to how do we have a zero trust framework. That was it's been most aggressively applied to identity, going back to workers bringing consumer devices into the workplace. And that is really, really important for organizations to do. There's some good momentum across many organizations on a zero trust identity and access routine. The attack surface that we're really worried about, that I think is the root of many of these breaches that are being reported daily now, oftentimes 4 or 5 times a day, is what you highlighted, Neil. What should be trusted, what people view as trusted communications between workloads. a application talking to a database talking to a set of APIs, an application talking to a SaaS service and enriching what they're doing from the application level to that SaaS service. If you think about what is an attacker trying to do, identity is important because they're usually trying to compromise a human or get their credentials so that they can direct what that human is doing. That's how they get in. It's very rare that that compromised set of credentials or human is going to have direct access to the things that are really going to do damage to an organization. What they do from there in a classic kill chain is if you're sophisticated at all, you're very patient. You sit where you've inserted yourself and you begin to map the flows across that data center or across that cloud. And you begin lateral movement. You come in on this exposed internet service that isn't properly patched, and you sit, and then you begin to map new credentials and eventually move to the crown jewels. And that's where the badness happens. It is generally through uninspected lateral movement. It's uninspected insertion. And we can talk about why that happens, and then uninspected lateral movement. And then you wake up all of a sudden and you didn't realize that you had adversaries in your network and in your apps for the past year or 2 years or 3 years, and they detonate a bunch of malware that cripples an organization, or more typically, they'll still exfiltrate a bunch of really important sensitive data and then try and hold the organization ransom with that data. So the attack surface that was once gated by a handful of physical data centers that you owned, where you could generally be trusted inside those data centers because of all the guards you had against the internet and all the physical security mechanisms you had around that on-prem data center. That world is gone. You now have got thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, depending on the complexity of the landscape for a corporation, of independent workloads, some of which you have provisioned directly. They're owned by you, many of which you're accessing through third parties, think GitHub or GitLab repos. And that is the attack surface. It's like every one of those workloads is the attack surface and all the communication channels between those workloads to the attack surface. And that really wasn't very prevalent 15 years ago because of the on-prem data center orientation. It is now the standard. I guess it's expected for very few organizations that haven't migrated some critical workloads to the cloud at this point in time. And that creates a whole new challenge for companies.
And I'm so glad you raised those points, because I also read that you've argued that attackers don't always break in. They simply log in. And I also saw a report on the BBC here in the UK about how hackers are identifying and offering disgruntled employees large sums of money, of cash, for their login details, which they can then use to log in. And there was a sting set up where they prove that this is exactly what they're doing. But can you expand on why stolen credentials, acquired credentials, or misconfigured workloads are so difficult to defend against?
Yes, yeah. And there's also, for those of you that haven't read this latest report, as we all went remote, you had all these remote employees. There are very organized groups that have a virtual employee become a certified, registered, cleared employee. And it's not the employee that gets the device because they're not coming in the office to get the device. They're being shipped to these groups and then directly controlled by these groups. So again, identity, if you think about if you assume that it's impossible to prevent all cyber incidents. That was one of the big mantras I had at Splunk, because Splunk is, which is my last company, it's this beautiful data repository that houses petabytes to exabytes of data for their organizations that allows companies to understand root cause. What happened after a breach is generally where you use Splunk most effectively. You're also trying to prevent breaches. But if you assume you can't prevent all breaches, then the real question is, how do you pivot quickly? How do you actually mitigate the damage of a breach? And there's only 3 control points where you can actually take action. We've talked about identity. That's one. I have compromised Neil. I've paid him $1 million to give me his credentials so I can use those. Ideally, you're an administrator of a really important set of systems. You've got root access. And it's worth it. You manage your company, and the $1 million is a lot. And they now take those credentials and start to do some damage. Once I detect that you're acting in an odd way, a control point is to sandbox you and stop your actions. But a control point means you actually have to take action. That's one of the three important control points for any defense in depth strategy. The second is an endpoint. Right? You could be fine, but there could be malware inserted on your PC or on a device that is accessing all those sensitive systems, and they're operating from the device. So endpoint security, CrowdStrike is probably the most notable company, but many, many companies do endpoint security, is another control point. You can shut down and quarantine that device. The third, which was really prevalent with on-prem data centers, is network security. If you assume that not every endpoint can be perfectly patched, and there will be malicious actors on an endpoint, and not every identity can be completely guaranteed to be safe. Again, a certified employee that's just turned rogue, forget the compromised credentials. Then the third defense in depth element is network. At the end of the day, our entire technical landscape is a device with an intent, a non-human or human identity, talking to a device over a network. So those are your three control points. And in cloud, in particular, network security, how to use a network as a control point, has been largely overlooked for a whole host of reasons that we can talk about as well. But if you want to stop, you can usually detect that a actor is acting in an odd way because they've got certain privileges and access routines that they routinely go through. And when they derivate, that can be a signal that you should probably begin to take action. If you really want to make sure nothing bad happens, you would lock down that identity, you'd lock down the device that they're operating from, and you would sever the network connections between the areas that you're seeing negative behavior around. And that way, your blast radius of the breach is super contained and manageable. You can pivot. If you don't have those controls, it's really hard to react in an effective way.
And of course, many security leaders will still talk about perimeter defense. Yeah, I also read that you've said castle and moat security is almost dead when it's in the cloud. So what makes cloud workloads so uniquely difficult to protect, especially when compared with traditional models? And almost feels like we're coming full circle because people are coming back in-house now. But what's the big difference here?
Yeah, and again, language is so hard because it's so powerful and it doesn't always port well. As humans, we do really well with analogies and metaphors. Yeah. And almost all of our cybersecurity language is taken from physical security experiences. And so the on-prem data center security language is all similar to what you do for defend a castle, defend a building, defend a house. And it was an old castle and moat orientation where your perimeter was the walls of the data center. And then you were guarding the connection that the internet had in and out of that data center. Then defense in depth, where you think about the moat and then the drawbridge and then the walls, and eventually they're going to try and get inside the castle to the room that you're trying to protect. With the cloud, the perimeter hasn't gone away. It's just no longer this coarse-grained large perimeter where all of your racks of servers and databases and applications and middleware layers are all sitting that were generally trusted. In the cloud, each one of those is a workload, and each one of those is sitting on top of this virtualized infrastructure that the cloud providers present. Those are now, your perimeter has gone from 7 data centers or 15 or 3 you had to defend to as many workloads as you have in the cloud. And again, many organizations have thousands to tens of thousands of workloads now. That's been made a lot more difficult the past 7, 8, 9 years because at first those workloads were perpetual, they're static, they were long-lived. As the Kubernetes wave came, that is a much more ephemeral set of workloads. The whole point of going to cloud is you could expand super quickly and unexpand, like only pay for what you use. That made it way harder to even understand what the perimeter was. And then the serverless movement started, which unlike Kubernetes is not standardized. So every cloud's got their own serverless architecture. That is way more ephemeral than Kubernetes, more efficient, better payback. But now you're not just protecting a known perimeter, the perimeter literally disappears. And then it reappears somewhere else. And then it lives 1 second this time, it lives for a minute and a half this time, it might live for 3 hours the next time. Standard mechanisms like I'm going to have everything be IP addressable And I'm going to have a line of sight for that thing begin to fail because of the ephemeral nature of the internet. And if we pivot to AI for a second, AI is the thing about an MCP server, which is a new construct for this wonderful agentic AI stuff that we're all going to get big benefits from. Those are serverless, ephemeral workloads. And the agents themselves that were once humans, those are now ephemeral, constantly shape-shifting workloads. So now the actors become ephemeral. The core infrastructure that you're deploying is ephemeral. And it's expanding at a very, very rapid rate. You've got a finite number of humans that you employ and contractors. We're theorizing every human's going to have 10 to 100 agents. So it's just getting way more complex. Like if you don't understand that the perimeter is atomized and there's now thousands to tens of thousands to millions of them, and the human has become ephemeral as well, then you're going to have a difficult time having an effective cybersecurity approach within your organization.
And I also read that you described cloud defense as a three-legged stool of identity, endpoint, and network. But identity often gets overemphasized. So tell me more about how attackers exploit an imbalance like that.
So we go back to what we were saying about 10 minutes ago.
Yep.
The new language is actually identity is a new perimeter.
Yeah.
And it kind of is. It kind of is. But there are human identities and agent identities, non-human identities, and then there are workload identities. And you need to actually manage both of those if you want to have a secure capability. So we go back to what we were saying 10 minutes ago. All three, the identity, the endpoint, and the network, need to have a thoughtful security approach, because the attacks can come from any of those vectors, but without the controls in place to watch those behaviors and, again, cordon things off and minimize the impact of an adversary, it's extremely difficult to have an effective cyber landscape. And while emphasizing identity, I'm like, all three are really important. And we've got a very strong identity stance at Aviatrix. You can't, it is very risky to believe that you're going to just through identity, you're going to prevent all malicious activity. Again, you just theorize that a valid employee that's been with you for 20 years, that's super trusted, changes their orientation. They've got valid credentials or a known entity. They're trusted, and all of a sudden they start changing their behavior. You need to be able to lock down the devices they're operating on and lock down the network channels they're using if you really want to stop that behavior, that bad behavior.
And we've talked today about the scale of the problems that you're seeing. So I'd now love to go into solution mode and talk a little bit about your cloud native security fabric. So how does embedding security into the network's fabric itself, how does that change the game compared to that traditional method of bolting on tools around the perimeter?
Yes, and that is what most people are doing. So I'll go back to Zscaler, which is Jay's very, very bright, very effective, and he's one that really championed the zero trust identity and access piece. How do they work? How does Cloudflare work? How does Cato Networks work? How do these names that you all might know, they're able to have their claims of very heightened network security because they've built points of presence. They own the infrastructure that everything runs on top of all over the world. And they route all communications through this very tight, hardened stack of their own infrastructure, their own software, and then the services that they provide. That activity takes place outside of what's happening inside of the clouds. It's a bypass network, which means you're outside looking in. It works super well for the claims that Cloudflare, Zscaler, Netscope, Cato have for what they do, but the workloads that you're trying to protect ultimately are sitting inside the cloud. If you want to get pervasive, for any of you that are interested, go look at how CISA and NIST and MITRE and Gartner and Forrester all define pervasive and effective cloud workload security. They all ultimately, it boils down to the traffic inside the cloud should be traffic front to cloud inside the clouds and two other clouds should be encrypted at the network layer, not just at the app layer. It's great to have app encryption, but you want to make sure that the bad guys aren't snooping on the lines. And you want pervasive visibility, detection, and control points across all of your workloads. Your VMs and VPCs and VNets and VCNs, different containers for more static workloads, your Kubernetes clusters, your serverless functions, your agentic AI functions. Every single one of those needs to have an inspection and control point. Without embedding that capability for both encryption and for that inspection and control, where the workloads live inside that cloud fabric, you've got to attach every one of those workloads to a bypass network, which theoretically can work.
Yeah.
If you do the math, though, and just think about the egress costs that will incur, which is one factor, but then start to do the additive latency impact as you route all that traffic to a bypass network and back. Most of these logical apps that we have are combinations of hundreds or many hundreds or even 1,000 different services. Their packets are hopping from all of these different workloads to complete the task. With network speak, like if every one of those hops, workload A goes out to the bypass network and back to make sure it's safe to talk to workload B, that then goes back out and back out. Like your applications are going to slow to a crawl. It's a huge network rework assignment. There also is both cost prohibitive from an egress perspective and latency prohibitive for most of the scenarios that people would contemplate. So the obvious thing, which is hard because you've got to build it properly, the way that clouds are architected, is insert all that capability into the cloud. Make it runs natively inside the cloud. And then I think you more elegantly and effectively attack the core of the problem. Which is what Aviatrix does.
Yeah, and as you said at the very beginning of the podcast, zero trust has become a buzzword across the industry. Not quite as much as AI, but it is up there. So what does zero trust for cloud networking, what does that look like in practice in a real world scenario? And how does CNSF, how does that bring that vision to life at scale?
So what we are advocating for is we want to augment the zero trust identity and access vernacular and approach that people have taken by adding in zero trust workloads, which means you got to assume that every workload with every communication could have malintent. It cannot be trusted because you never know which adversary is living in which workload. And much like every single time that I access core services from Aviatrix, I'm being revalidated. Is it still Doug? Is he doing the right things? What's he allowed to do? Let me just recertify that. It's the same thing with workloads. So the zero trust workload framework, to do that, you ideally would need a solution that lives alongside every one of those workloads. It's able to immediately understand what's coming in and going out of any workload, even if it's an ephemeral workload. And additionally, and that's what generally people call egress security, just the communication into and out of that workload, which is an important starter point, because the bad adversaries are just trying to get themselves planted somewhere. And then they're immediately trying to get a command and control framework. Like just inserting some code there that is mine is okay. It's not necessarily detrimental unless you call back out and establish a connection so that that malware, that code can start to do something bad and nefarious. But the second element is what workloads are allowed to talk to which workload. And it's much more difficult because you've got huge combinations of things happening instead of just in and out. And you have to really move to an intent-based policy framework. And you have to have a identity construct per workload that works as well. So it's very orthogonal thinking from how a traditional firewall would work. That's much more hierarchical and deterministic policies. It doesn't necessarily always understand the intent of the application itself and the communications, and it generally relies on a known endpoint, a known IP address. And all those are off the table for most modern cloud deployments within organizations today.
And if we were to look ahead and take into account everything that you're seeing out there, all the conversations you're having with customers and all the trends around that, how do you expect the role of network visibility and control to evolve, especially as organizations increasingly face more sophisticated AI-powered threats? How do you see all this evolving in the months and years ahead?
We've been evangelizing this cloud native security fabric approach for almost a year now.
Yeah.
And what I've seen over the past year, and it's probably more and more news articles on lateral movement and how some of these breaches really actually occur. But for the first time in the past few months, I'm no longer getting I think I get what you're saying, but let me think about it. It's a little more of, okay, this is the beginning to make sense. So there's, I think, a growing awareness of the need for network security starting to get its rightful length of that third leg. It's either been missing or it's very short, which doesn't create a great stool. And the other big tailwind, I think, is the agentic AI wave. Because again, if you just spend a little bit of time and do first principles orientation and foundational architectural orientation, all an agentic AI app is a series of workloads being interacted with a series of identities. And those identities are running on some compute. So it goes back to identity, endpoint, and network being back as important. Endpoint is more difficult in an agentic AI landscape because all the frameworks are generally ephemeral. And endpoint traditionally requires a static agent to be inserted on that endpoint. So we've got endpoint security for all of our devices, and I had to download an agent to my laptop to make sure that IT could see what's going on with that laptop. And do I need to shut that laptop down or not? When you've got an ephemeral workload, you cannot insert that static agent. So that's where what I keep seeing is for the future, identity and network are going to be the longer legs of the stool, with endpoints still be important because we're all going to have our devices and there's going to be IoT frameworks where there are going to be static compute that you can deploy endpoint on. It's not going away in any way. But the core of agentic, I think, is going to over-rotate to both identity and network. And I think the biggest challenge that most CISOs have right now is there's so much noise on AI in general, and there's so much noise on what to pay attention to. For example, how do you stop a prompt engineering attack? It's got so much energy right now, and that is important. That is definitely important. What is prompt engineering attack? It is basically convincing Neil to do something you shouldn't do. It's back to an identity compromise.
Yeah.
That is important. It's important to look at. The most important for me, like I have such a tough time not getting away, straying from foundations, is contemplate that. But what is your foundational identity security control points? How do you stop Neil from acting in a weird way? Not just how do you stop the bad guy from talking to Neil? And then what is your foundational network controls? Let's assume that with all of your efforts, Neil starts acting in a bad way. How do you make sure that he's not able to get access to some of the important assets that you really, really don't want compromised? So I just keep vectoring down to everything in life is risk analysis and prioritization. And as a CISO and a CIO, I'm just going to keep pounding the table on do the foundation, like overweight there. And then you can add other really important elements. There's so many 3 and 4 letter acronyms in the cybersecurity landscape for good reasons. There's so many different areas that you need to protect in different ways. But if you're not on the foundation set, it doesn't work. You've got a teetery house that's creaking everywhere because they didn't build the foundation properly. And that's the hard part of our message right now is humanity is definitely besieged by distraction. Like we've gotten so click oriented to the latest news story or whatever I'm consuming on my devices. And I'm trying to argue, slow things down, take care of the basics, then go back and be distracted, but take care of the basics,
Love it. And I feel compelled to say, for the most part, Neil doesn't act in a weird and
Yes,
paranoid
no, yeah, I wouldn't expect that you would be. It's conversationally it works because we're talking.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights with me today. Love chatting with you. We've been able to have a bit of fun as well. But as someone working right in the heart of this space, I suspect you're a big reader too. So we have a wish list for books that I ask my guests to recommend to people listening. So as one final gift, are there any books that you would like to recommend that I add to that list?
So I am ping-ponging between two very, very different modalities right now. One of my favorite human behavior and how do you live a good life authors is a guy named Joshua Medcalf, who is famous for one of his books, Chop Wood, Carry Water, but he's got 11, 12, 13 books. And I like every week I'll go back and re-listen to one of his books. And it's ultimately, how do you focus on mastery in the daily process and not over rotate on outcomes? I want to win the Super Bowl. That's great. When you get there, you're probably not that happy. Focus on how do you be the best football player you can be every single day. And the other element that I am going back and forth on, which is radically different, is I've gone deep down the quantum rabbit hole the past few months. We do high performance encryption. We've got a unique patent for that, encrypt everything in the cloud, as well as this workload protection element. And the big threat to encryption is we're getting closer, who knows when, to quantum becoming real, quantum computing being real, and every encryption algorithm that we have today being very, very easily solvable, which is not possible with classic compute. And so after watching a bunch of Young Sheldon and Star Trek through the years, it's like, let me go deeper on like, really, really, what is quantum physics? What is quantum mechanics? And that has been fascinating. And so I've got three quantum computing books, starting with quantum computing for dummies, and three different quantum physics books that you between a Joshua Medcalf book. I'll go and read one of those.
Wow, love it. It's quite a rabbit hole to go down. I'll add links to everything now, get them added to the Amazon wish list for people to check out. And for yourselves, of course, anyone wanting to find out more about you, contact your team, etc., check out the website and any information about anything we talked about today. Where's the best starting point?
Aviatrix.com is a great place to start for the elements that we're advocating. There is a dearth. I've been toying with the idea of writing a book on practical cloud security because there is a dearth of books that cover what we talked about. There's some really interesting books on how does cloud work and what are all different services and how do you climb up the curve on using DynamoDB. And I just have not been able to find from a 10,000 foot level, how does cloud work? Now, what do you mean the perimeter's been atomized? But if any of you find some great books out there with that point of view, let me know, because I have not yet been able to surface them. But
challenge accepted. Awesome. Well, I'll get links added to everything. And we've discussed a lot today, from how the attack surface is widening, why traditional security often fails in the cloud, and organizations that are not adapting are often finding themselves blindsided by network blind spots. But there are some good answers, some solutions out there, and so much to be hopeful for, and so many great opportunities as well. So just thank you for shining a light on this today.
Really appreciate it, Daniel.
So as Doug reminded us today, the cloud has redefined the very fabric of enterprise security. The old idea of defending a single perimeter, I think, has dissolved into a web of micro perimeters, workloads and connections that can change by the minute. And attackers are aiming to exploit this fluidity, moving laterally through environments that most teams cannot fully observe. And the answer, as Doug argues there, isn't just to abandon the cloud, it's to rebuild security into its connective tissue. And that concept of cloud-native security fabric, I think, reframes cybersecurity as part of the network itself, not just an add-on at the edge. And by securing every workload, every connection, and every lateral movement, organizations can finally gain the kind of visibility and control that they need to protect what matters most. And with AI fueling and fighting cyber attacks, I think the race is on to stay one step ahead through automation, context, and data-driven defense. But if today's conversation sparked any ideas with you about how your organization can close the visibility gap, remember to check out my guest. And please, I'd love to hear your perspective too. If you think the industry can achieve true zero trust in the cloud, let me know your thoughts. Join the conversation. techtalksnetwork.com. You'll find several ways you can message me there. But that's it for today. So thank you as always, and I'll speak with you all again tomorrow. Bye for now.